We are running slightly over time, so I want to get going with our next session, which is on when. Our three speakers, and please forgive me for my really bad pronunciation in advance, are Galina, Oustinova-Stjepanovic, Svitlana, Osipchuk, and Jessica Zychowicz. Sorry. Okay, so Galina is an anthropologist who works in local community projects, including with an NGO for Muslim women exploring experiences of conflict and reconciliation. Svitlana works for a Donbass Media Forum project and also coordinates projects for the Ukrainian Center for Holocaust Studies. And Jessica is working with Ukrainian artists to restore and exhibit canonical works from the Soviet era in rural museums. So we're going to go in the order that they're in the programme, and I'm going to ask Galina to speak first.
Yes, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I prepared a talk, and then I started crossing out the things that have already been mentioned, so I feel I don't have all that much to say, but when it comes to sort of anthropological understanding of impact, if you can call that, like many of you, I feel, that the people we work with should somehow benefit from what we do, and that might be one definition of impact, and sometimes it is, this idea is slightly problematic for anthropologists, for many reasons, conceptual, disciplinary, as well as, practical, but what happens, and I'll give you just slightly anecdotal examples, is, for example, Anton Valkovsky, he works on human rights, and he was asked by a community, if you can call it a community, by some activists among First Nations in Canada, around Vancouver, to write a letter, in support of their claims, to land, and when he started writing the letter, he discovered that the language of anthropology does not entirely correspond to the language of an activist claim like that, because what he had to do, he had to essentialize and reify kind of the understanding and the description of those people by making emphasis, by placing emphasis on them as a traditional community, as people who have preserved a coherent lifestyle, and these things went in many ways at loggerheads with what he observed and what people themselves aspired to, but they had to formulate their claims in that kind of reified language, which they equally found problematic, but felt strategically it's worthwhile, So anthropologists, I actually ask sometimes to buy a boat, as I mentioned, for a community, but we do a lot of letter writing, so we actually contribute our language skills, and understanding of how you can formulate something, how you can write. And, some of these things backfire, because there is another example of Roger Keating, who wrote also a letter, which seemed to be like a fairly straightforward letter, outlining people's claim to property in Papua New Guinea, choir people, and what happened is that there was actually a rift within the community, and resulted in military clashes, so violent clashes, among people within the village. He was thrown out of the place, lost the funding and things like that, So when you think about what you can give back to communities, or to people you work with, it is problematic on many levels, because you also have a certain accountability for the funding you have, and you also kind of have a responsibility, if we don't want to acknowledge it, we do have a responsibility to the academic community, to learn something and then say something about our research, and there is another thing for many anthropologists is that, we do not always, the assumption is, but we work with people we call sometimes the suffering subject, the underdogs, the good people who are somehow oppressed, but in reality we do work with people, we do work up in the sense, we do work with elites, we work with corporations, we work with far-right people, as well, extreme, what you know, sometimes people say repugnant people, you know, in quotation marks, you know, like about, you know, which also makes this idea of giving back, you know, kind of difficult, you know. So this is one thing, you know, but then I also kind of reflected on my experience of reviewing grant applications where you are asked to specify, you know, what you can do for impact, you know, and, you know, I noticed a tendency to conflate impact with outputs, you know, like, I mean, which in many academic communities, your outputs would be your publications. So a monograph, you know, so people say, my impact is that I'll publish 3 articles with American ethnologists and stuff like that, you know, like, I mean, and, you know, I was wondering about that, you know, and I thought, sort of kind of my knee-jerk instinctual reaction would be to say, no, well, impact should be something else. It could be conceptual as well. It could be an idea that can go, you know, can become part of Creative Commons, for example, or popularized, you know, maybe there are findings, you know, and, you know, not necessarily people you work with would benefit, but somebody else along the line, you know. So I was thinking about that, you know, and then at the same time, you know, when, you know, and just a couple of weeks ago, you know, like somebody asked me to review an application for an American institution, you know, and there was like, would that project benefit American economy, you know, like, and I was wondering that, okay, this is very specific, right, you know, like, and so I said, like, yeah, I'm not sure about that, you know, like, but I do see a potential, like, the proposal was poorly written, but the potential for the project was there. So, yeah, that's why I was thinking about that, you know, and in the end, you know, what I wanted to say, you know, like, I mean, that particular application made me feel really uneasy, you know, because I felt like, you know what, I said, I'm not sure about the benefits for American economy, you know, like, I mean, but I see intellectual merits in this proposal, you know, and I felt that I had to, I said I would recommend it for funding for that reason, not because of any economic impact, you know, I did not really see that, you know, in that proposal. Personally, I did not, maybe it's there, but I did not see it like this, you know, like, and then I started thinking about what is it about impact that many people find somehow disquieting, you know, like, I mean, you know, I don't cringe when people ask me about the impact of my work, you know, like, I mean, but I always feel I need to justify what I do, you know, like, I need to somehow put a spin on it, you know, like, I mean, and, you know, frankly, you know, I do not engage a lot with communities, you know, what I did with Bosnian women, for example, you know, that was part of, you know, being within the department, you know, and, you know, they have a program set up for you, you know, people send you emails saying, like, you know, there are these people who would like to approach you for your expertise, would you be willing? And of course you say, sure, of course I will meet them, you know. So I kind of felt, you know, yes, am I that kind of ivory tower, as they say, academic scholar, you know, like, and then, you know, I started thinking about all these things, and the idea about impact and what I find problematic is that it seems to be underpinned by a particular dichotomy and understanding that theory and action are 2 separate things, you know, like, I mean, and that goes actually really, really deep, you know, like, into our sort of understanding of idealism, for example, and realism in philosophy, or our value of kind of more empirical findings over conceptual or speculative things, you know, like, I mean, and today you feel that there are lots of people who are trying to upend those assumptions about theory, you know, that theory is just something, you know, in your mind, and, you know, it has no impact whatsoever, you know, like, so I feel what is interesting is to maybe also think about intellectual labor, you know, like, I mean, not something which is completely isolated from the world out there, you know, but something which is impactful in its own right, you know, like, I mean, maybe differently, and, you know, it can, you know, can be probably felt more, you know, through dissemination of ideas, you know, but ideas do circulate, you know, like, I mean, and they do have a material quality as well, you know, so I felt that, you know, it is difficult to think about impact if the whole idea is organized along these lines of very instrumental work, you know, so you have means to an end, you know, like, I mean, and the end should be something tangible, and somebody yesterday, I think you mentioned about intangible impact, you know, like, I mean, I really think that we should be pushing this idea forward, you know, intangible impact, which comes from intellectual labor, you know, which could be recognized as such. So yeah, maybe not economic impact, you know, but that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Galina. And Svitlana.
Yeah. I was really thrilled when I got an invitation from Daria and Victoria, but at the same time I was wondering actually if really my work is about doing public engagement projects. I even had to check with Google if my projects are really about public engagement. So I'm not still sure about that. Why is it so? Because actually I'm an educator. I have been an educator for the last 8 years. I teach history at the university for 8 years, and then after a few years at the beginning I realized that my idea of teaching history and the formal narrative, formal course of formal education is not really in line, so I had to find some new ways to do teaching. So I ended up with the non-formal education. At first I was a lecturer, and then I became a manager for those projects. And since that time I'm working in the area of the Holocaust studies. It is very specific thing in Ukraine because actually memory and knowledge about the Holocaust was eliminated during the Soviet period in Ukraine. It was like vanished intentionally by the state, and the Soviet state was really anti-Semitic till the end. So I guess in 1991 we was not really in the 0 point for the Holocaust studies, but like in the minus point for that. So in the 90s also it was the period of so-called national building in the states after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So somehow the history as an idea of the history as a teaching process was not really inclusive, not really about, I don't know, minorities, different genders, ethnic groups, and so on. And since the beginning of 2000 period, I guess it's just like trying to find the idea of this multi-narrative is trying to find the way in Ukraine. So why I'm explaining that actually now we have not really memory about that. Very few people still carry some like local memory about the Holocaust. As well, no really like half of a page about the Holocaust in the textbooks. It brought the question was like got in the official attention for the last 6 years, I guess. After Maidan, the situation had changed from my experience. So finally, the non-formal education about this topic got some systematic help from the government. This is a situation where I'm working, and my organization splits its work on 3 different directions: research, but it's kind of academic research, so then education and commemoration. And I'm mostly involved in the educational projects. That's why I was not really sure if it's a public engagement thing, because the education is a very private thing, even when we do our year project, like for the group of 15 or 30 or 60 people, because we have to select them. We have to select them on some formal criteria, and also we have to select them through the most important criteria, the own willingness of the people to do that, because teachers we work mostly with teachers, and teachers in Ukraine are obliged to increase their qualifications from time to time, but still they could choose different ways to do that. They could choose very formal ways to do that. Yeah, and if a teacher approach us with his or her willingness to participate in our project, it usually means that the person is highly motivated to do that. And of course, some people are like a bit more into this educational tourism, but still most people are about motivation of themselves. And we do these projects. We try to give people knowledge, but not only knowledge, like language, how to speak about this topic, also some recent approaches from academia, from non-formal education, so they could spread their knowledges, all these things in the schools. And usually teachers even have to struggle with the local administration, because local administrations are not really into experiments. They're mostly about some formal requirements. So, for example, on some dates, there are official calls to commemorate some dates from the Holocaust calendar or memorial calendar of Ukraine, the whole. So, and usually teachers are expected to bring certain amount of students to the site, make them maybe not only feel, but at least express certain feelings in public. And then they expected to report on this event as a very successful event of commemoration. So it's a kind of very strange idea of commemoration and feeling something about the event from the past. And then at the same time, formal education is still a very resourceful thing to work with. So if we want to reach more children, it was our idea, if we want to reach new generations of people who live now in the territory with very small amount of memory of some events, we want to reach children, so we want to reach teachers to make, to let them reach children with some ideas. So we work with teachers, and we managed actually to establish a very good network of teachers on in the different regions. So when we have our project from the other direction, from the commemoration, we now have local agents on the sites who helped us to do that. So somehow it's about the question when the engagement ends from our roundtable. I think for our work it never ends. At least we have some percentage of people who always stay with us in our work on the local side. For example, we had our organization had a project of building monuments on some local sites of mass killings in Ukraine. It's usually the site in the village or in the small neighborhood when something happened, but nothing marks the territory about this, and nobody actually carries the memory about this. So usually our main criteria to, when we made a list of sites to build monuments, we still selected the sites where we have at least one person who will activate the memory after the monument is built, because if we just put a stone there, even proper academically discussed stone, like of proper form and very much inclusive of each group of victims here, but still nobody would care after that about the site. It's like, I think it would be a failure. So usually we manage to, we selected sites when we have people to communicate with them after that. So, and I think it was a very successful project because it shows that we have a lot of people who continue work with us after like our educational projects. And for me, when I was thinking about the question of this roundtable, I think the ending of engagement is about our own capacities and also about our own boundaries and limits, because when you do a public engagement project, you have to be very clear of your own role, and because when you start doing these projects, like devastating your own resources, it's not really a good way to do that, because you are very limited yourself, and everything will end very quickly. So yeah, but when you expand your network, it will basically, of course, help to do that. That's it.
Thank you very much.
So, in thinking about time, I had to go all the way back to 2005, really. I can say that's when my project started, which was trying to understand the project in Ukraine. I became very interested in Ukraine as a civic space while a student at Berkeley, observing the Orange Revolution, my peers essentially, part of a revolution on the other side of the ocean, and I wanted to know more about this. So I went to Ukraine and I taught English for 2 years, and I learned Ukrainian. And then I went to graduate school, and writing my dissertation took a really, really long time. But then I turned it into a book. And so I can say my real project is my book, which will be published this summer on University of Toronto Press. And the title is Superfluous Women, Feminism, Art, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine. So the process of writing this book has really been a co-authorship, I would say, with all of my interlocutors over 10 years, the decade between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. And in this decade, I couldn't see it as a decade because it was an ongoing space of revolutionary change and radical political upheaval that women who reached out to me while I was trying to find my dissertation topic were teaching me really about what their self-identification as feminism meant to them. And at that time, that was like 2008, they were organizing the Women's March. Now it's called the Women's March, but at that time it was called the Feminist March in Kiev that happens on March 8th. And attached to that march were lots of different issues like labor equality, reproductive rights, things that we were also fighting for on the other side of the ocean. So in this idea of time and projects, there's also place, where you come from or where you see yourself becomes more complicated the longer you spend in your field site, let's say, if we're borrowing some terminology from anthropology. And you become a part of it, and it becomes a part of you, and there's some benefit, I think, to being lost a little bit and to giving up control as an academic of the frameworks of the laboratory and allowing for some of the experiment to drive your inquiry or change your questions, because the people you meet are alive and changing themselves, and so you have to embrace being lost in time and space and adapt to that in a way that becomes, I think, more tactical than strategic often. And I say that with a caveat, because there are all these issues of like safety and ethics and things like that. But I would say in responding to the challenge of our panel, which is to draw the lifetime of our project and discuss the implications of delivering on the timeline. My book is still very much evolving into different avenues that are not necessarily where I thought I would be going with the knowledge that I've accumulated. So I'm working on 2 different exhibits. One will take place in Alberta, Canada, where I am based at the University of Alberta. The other one will be in Ukraine. And I feel like I'm working on both sides of the ocean, but I'm also in this circular dynamic of the project of Ukraine because I'm in the diaspora setting in Canada, which is politicized in ways that have illustrated to me generational conflict. So as researchers and as project designers working with the public, the views of different generations and how we're working with those generations can really be a resource. It can be a way of seeing what is true in your paradigm and filtering out what kinds of truths you don't want to inherit maybe from a mentor that is more experienced than you. I have a quote here from Svitlana Zychowicz and her book Secondhand Time, because I just thought it was something that should be mentioned in this panel, that she is speaking really of this the last Soviet generation, and she says, pretty soon I'll be decomposing into phosphorus, calcium, and so on. Who else would you find to tell you the truth? All that's left are the archives, pieces of paper. And the truth is, I worked at an archive myself. I can tell you firsthand, paper lies even more than people do. So the construction, again, of truth and the faith in academic work is something we have to constantly negotiate. And part of that is giving value to experience and people's stories and the oral histories that they tell, balancing that against what's been put on paper, and also always understanding that our paradigms are changing, and we're like always going to disagree. and I think that is a good place to start, is disagreement between generations as being a place where productive conflicts can happen, and the work you're doing can be more illustrated or even muddied by those conflicts in ways that push you to do something that is controversial and therefore matters to a public, because a public is built through conversation, it's built through disagreement and consensus, moments of consensus. And I'm finding that quite a bit in my current space that I'm working in the diaspora. There are older waves of Ukrainian Canadians who have brought ideas from, and traumas, real traumas from World War II that are not always being worked through. And one of those areas has really been about sort of reclaiming a space within the larger Canadian idea of being Canadian, idea of multiculturalism. What is this idea, and how beneficial is it to an individual versus a group? The other challenge is gender. The exhibit I'm doing in the fall of this year in University of Alberta is called Samvidov, or Samizdat, self-publishing, underground work. And I'm working with women authors who have done amazing things since the 1970s in particularly the Canadian-Ukrainian community, starting a housing co-op, writing 7 novels, things like this. And we're thinking about what smuggled knowledge means, to smuggle ideas across borders and between generations. And Ukraine, again, is a site that's always fascinated me for civic reasons, because there are so many interesting art forms that have come out of censorship. I mean, I'm not advocating for censorship, that's the opposite. I'm saying that it's very hard to identify what it is. I think it came up yesterday in one of our conversations, but the forms that have evolved out of that, the marks of the censor, the underground work, the unofficial versus official, all of that I think is something that the Soviet generations, or even the immigrant communities have quite a bit to offer in terms of teaching us, and us, I mean like those of us who don't remember the Soviet era, staying humble in light of that knowledge, I think is really important. The other challenge that I have in terms of time is a time lag in the diaspora, because there are ideas about the nation of Ukraine from the 1930s that are still alive as though that were today. And the contemporary, I work with a team of 7 Ukrainians who are my age, who are from East Ukraine, and they don't connect at all with the second wave or third wave Ukrainian generation in Canada around questions of, Nazi collaboration or Stepan Bandera and nationalism. Like, these are really hard areas to discuss. And the second exhibit I'm working on in Ukraine is really at that nerve. So I'm thinking through, and I'm very interested, especially in your work on the Holocaust in Ukraine, very interested in this area, also having some Polish background, and how to navigate that intergenerationally without alienating mentors. Like, I really want to be able to receive knowledge, but I don't feel that I should have to accept everything wholesale. That's not good pedagogy. So that's basically what I'm thinking about in terms of mapping the lifetime of my project. And the other question, I think, for our panel was, what does it mean to deliver on these time frames? All I could think of was David Bowie's song, Time May Change Me, but I can't change time. So do we get to choose our time frames, is my question. Or do they choose us? So that's all.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you to all our 3 speakers. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes summing up, and then going to invite questions from you all. There were various overlapping angles there. Angles to do with language, how we find the right language to speak about certain issues, how we help other people find the right language, and how language is bound up with memory and with textual memory in terms of the archive. When can we trust language? But you also, in various ways, all came back to this idea, our panel's question about when. When does a project start? And I think we heard that actually it goes back a long way, and it draws on our previous experiences as a teacher, for example, as a student. It's really hard to identify the start of a project. But funding applications need us to think about this well in advance. We also need to predict the end point while we're still immersed in the start of the project. So, there was something about the need to plan for engagement and to plan for this end point, but this end point is ongoing. This end point, we never reach this end point. I think Svitlana, you said it never ends, but that we also then, given this kind of endlessness of it, we need to be able to build on our own capacities, our own resources as researchers. And I think that's something that Jessica was saying about how time and space intersect. We can't talk about time without also thinking about space and how the spaces change time. So the space of Ukraine, there's this time lag between what your colleagues in Canada are experiencing compared to what your colleagues in Ukraine are experiencing. 2 other final thoughts that I really struck with me were these ideas of being lost and being open to experiment and being also open to disagreement. Because we always think of engagement as this wholly productive thing. We go out to the community and we all have a wonderful time, but actually we also need to disagree, and that we need to feel safe enough in order to have those disagreements and to be able to find language to work through those disagreements. And the final thing, we don't get to choose time. So we're all under very different constraints. I know that colleagues in the UK is different from colleagues in the States, different from colleagues in Ukraine, but we all have very different pressures on our time and our resources. How do we put an endpoint onto something that's ongoing, and ongoing not just in our lifetimes, but we're thinking much further ahead, legacies of the future. So with this, this involves going right back to the past and thinking much further into the future. So with that grand scope in mind, has anyone got any questions? I think we'll take about 3 questions from the audience and then we'll hand back to our speakers. Any questions?
I got one. Yeah, it just builds on your comments actually, Sarah. I just want to think a bit further about this idea of managing the legacies of your work. I was really struck by what you were saying, Svitlana, about how, in a sense, your work is kind of laying the foundations for people to do things in the future. So kind of building the capacities of teachers so that then they can go on to teach for themselves. So exchanging or kind of communicating these tools for people to be able to build a local capacity to do what you're trying to incentivize for themselves. And then the monument work obviously is kind of orientated towards the future. But I'm thinking about, this tension, and I think like this is coming up quite a lot across the various panels, that there are tensions at play between, the micro-planning that you put into a project and the way in which you, whether it's a kind of performance on paper or a performance or a live performance, how you demonstrate like full knowledge and control over every element of the project. When you write, for example, a big grant application, you're writing with that particular, you're writing in that register of, being the ultimate authority who can control every aspect of this, and almost can see into the future. Many of the things are quite speculative that we have to write about. How you balance that against a healthy kind of lack of control or a sense of being lost. Where the balancing point is. If it is something that, is just a secret, an open secret that you don't ever kind of exhibit to funding bodies, and they know that and you know it, and so what's going on there exactly? Or if it is something that we should be foregrounding and thinking about more carefully, the kind of, I'm sure lots of people in this room who are project managers have thought about this very carefully, how you plan for an unplanned future for your project, especially when you're dealing with difficult topics and problematic history and heritage.
Thank you.
Yes, just a simple thing to muse on, and I'd be interested to hear each one of your perspectives on this. But thinking about those beginnings and ends, and the entanglements that we get into with people, and how you do come to an end. It's not even necessarily about resources, but it's about those relationships, and the ethics of tying up or leaving them open. But what it does to us, I guess, in terms of resources, in terms of time resources and life resources, how those things can build up over time.
One more question here.
It sounds like all these projects are dealing with different generations, and I, as an American who is working in Ukraine, I've definitely seen this different disposition of the diaspora population to the current population. I don't know as much about the Holocaust-related stuff, but I'm kind of curious about how each of you negotiate that relationship, and if you feel like you have a certain allegiance to one or the other of those groups, and how that might be expressed in the work that you're doing, or if you're always trying to create this like equal space where all the voices have equal weight, and is that even like a valid way to approach it? Yeah.
Thank you. So 3 questions about how we balance the tensions between kind of predicting the future of our research, micro-planning it, micro-managing it, and everything being lost. Thinking about the beginning and ends of our relationships with other people, research, both colleagues and participants, and the ethics of managing those relationships, and also thinking about how you negotiate the relationships between different generations. So, anyone want to start that? Perhaps Svitlana, would you be happy to say something a little bit about the first one, about how you manage the kind of the planning with the legacy?
I'm thinking that maybe my answer would be a little bit obvious. I think but I know that it was a very hard process of reflecting for me myself. That at some point I realized that I have to just let it go because it's you know, when we have a very big discussion, for example, about Babin Yar in Ukraine, if you know this site, it's like the biggest site of mass killings, and it's still in the center of Kiev. It's like the park where people walk, walking dogs and so on. So they actually having fun there, and we have a very big public discussion of what people can do there and what people are not allowed to do there. And my approach, I know that many people sometimes are shocked because people even I don't know, have picnics there. So obviously having a lot of fun there. And my approach is that you can do what you can do, but if you try to control everything in the space where your work is located, you just would go mad very quickly because, you know, people have a lot of reactions. And I know it's normal, for example, in Ukraine, after all this historical experience, it's a really normal thing, and it's very useful not to judge, but to observe how people react on your work. And it's very informative for you as a manager, as a project manager, because when you see, for example, I do this and this, like my project about intervention in the space or intervention into the knowledge of people, and then they somehow reacted not how I expected them to react. And of course, if it happened, I would say, if I would say half of the times, it's really successful work. So when I see that, I try to analyze why this is happening, what the parts of the memory, of family memory, like local memory, national memory, how it's mixed into this reaction. So I'm just observing, analyzing, and I'm really actually glad that now we have a society when people could react how they want to react. But still, of course, some extremal points. It's also a big question for me because people could vandalize monuments, people could vandalize sites and leave there some descriptions or I don't know offensive words, and they do it in the night, so they want to express themselves but do it secretly. So of course I could be offended by that, but still I know that it is it's the field where I'm working, so I just have to deal with it.
So sort of recognise that you can't control.
Yeah, of course,
learning
of course.
how.
And I think it's a very it's a very megalomaniacal thing to think that you can control everything in your work, and very exhausting at the same way. So, but I was at that point, I think at the beginning, but then changed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Galina, do you want to answer?
I just wanted to, I was thinking about the temporality of also kind of research and then publications perhaps, coming, but one thing that anthropologists tend to emphasize and then explain to others is that we are not journalists, which is not maybe quite fair to journalists, because the idea there is that journalists after very urgent, perhaps topical events, coming, and the idea is to publish as fast as you can, while anthropologists tend to sit on their work, and then it takes sometimes 2-3 years to publish a decent article, so there is a moment when, you're working in it, when it's reviewed, when it comes back to you, things like this, but, kind of feel that this is the right process, it gives you an opportunity as a scholar to reflect on your work, for other people to comment on it, and maybe to create that long-lasting legacy, to have something, which will be read and reread regardless of the circumstances, so that there is a moment, that this can probably transcend the immediacy, of research, so there is something about that, and when it comes to entanglements, betrayal, yes, you betray the people you work with, you promise to come back, you never come back, you say, I will remember your birthday, you don't. It's what it is, very rarely, you have that emotional connection which really lasts for years, you try, it's a promise you make, and I feel, you never keep it.
And do we have responsibility to not make those promises?
Sometimes I think it's more honest to say it like this. I really do, maybe it's a little bit easier if you what they call a native anthropologist when you tend to come back, just because your family is somewhere, in Russia, so you might revisit those relationships, but, some places I did field work, it was a one-off, I got funding to go somewhere far and that's it, and some people go to, from England to Vanuatu, which is like really far away, they spend a year, really intense year, having relationships, fathering children, happen, and then again, there is that breakdown of everything, so I really think it is better, instead of making those promises, to explain to people, I might be just that thing in your life, and you in mine, and that's it, but what makes this relationship enduring is precisely a chance to create maybe a publication or tell their story in a way that will be exciting for many people and many generations to read.
So there's perhaps a way you maintain those relationships without the person-to-person contact through some sort of artifact or monument too.
Right. This is also kind of like an explanation. But a good story. Can last, so, there is that value, but, just, as anthropologists, of course, we, I kind of realize that many people are not quite aware of that, we do create composite characters, we describe a person, it's not one person. It's usually 2 or 3 people that we bring together into a character. It's done partly to protect people's own identity, but it is also a device, perhaps, because you see connections, so we don't do it strictly. That's why the anthropology sits somewhere between fiction and reality, a lot,
That's good. You got any?
Yeah, in response to what you were mentioning about diaspora and generational conflicts, and I think a lot of navigating the differences when it comes to different Ukraines and times and places is a lot about self-knowledge and humility and remembering how one got to where they are. It took a lot of other people. It's not just me that somehow landed in a institute that was built from 1970s with a specific purpose, which was to aid dissidents and defectors from the Soviet Union and to work within this idea of the human rights and the UN, and sometimes that gets lost, and keeping the bigger picture is nice, and we all want to do that, but there are moments when you have to just own your narrative and own who you are and say that I'm not going to participate in a dynamic that is about in-grouping and out-grouping, because nationalism is a universal. Every nation does it and has it, and it's something that I don't think belongs in a university space. And this university is mine because I'm here. So there's moments like that, but there's also moments where you have to remember that your cross-cultural fluency might not be catching everything that you're hearing, or you're responding to a stereotype of a diaspora community that's not necessarily true, because I've met a lot of really incredible individuals who themselves from within the diaspora are challenging those kind of nationalistic impulses. And I'm always surprised also by age, because older individuals can be really, really progressive and cutting edge in what they have to offer to a university setting. There's the stereotype of like an old stodgy professor who kind of forgot what research is, and my institution that I'm in and the diaspora itself is an aging population. A lot of the funding for projects comes from the framework of specific endowments that were created for particular village maybe that somebody had immigrated from, and they thought this village would become a city and it didn't, and so now nobody can access the money. So there are like practical barriers that come up in that inertia of an institution that I'm working within, but I think there's also a lot of potential for more interrelationality in remembering or in giving your own vulnerability, putting your vulnerability onto the table and telling people where you're coming from. I mean, I have a history too. My family has Polish heritage, and my grandparents were aiding Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. And it was really important to them that the intellectuals and the working class were working together, because my grandfather was working class grocer. And these kinds of stories, these heritages, they influence everything we write and we do, and we're always writing about ourselves in our research, I think. We can't just erase the author and pretend we did something objective. I mean, there's data, and there is truth, and there is fact, but in the humanities and the arts, it's always this autobiography too that's coming through, I think, in our work and the topics we choose. So,
thank you. Any of you want to say anything else? Okay, it is 12 o'clock, so we're going to move into the table discussions.